Tonight on Politicat, restricting access, we look at the recent abortion bills causing controversy.
And trade war with China, is there a deal in sight?
Plus, where do we get our news? How to find meaningful stories in a sea of information.
Those stories and more tonight on Politicat.
It's your politics right now.
Good evening and welcome to Politicat. I'm Justin Sweetwood.
And I'm Joey Safchik. There's a lot of news to cover this week. Let's unpack it. 3 weeks ago, President Donald Trump filed suit in an attempt to stop the House Democrats' subpoena for 8 years of his tax records. After a major hearing today, that seems unlikely. Federal Judge Amit Mehta said the Supreme Court hadn't ruled against a congressional subpoena in over a century, but added that he wouldn't make a ruling this week. This hearing comes the same week the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee announced they've subpoenaed Donald Trump Jr. in relation to the Russia probe.
Is Facebook too dominant? Co-founder Chris Hughes argued that it is in an explosive New York Times op-ed against his former company last week. 2020 Democratic candidates like Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren are also backing him. They argue that the company could be violating antitrust laws. These calls come as Facebook grapples with widespread public backlash that has grown over the past few years.
Yesterday, 187 countries agreed to limit plastic pollution at a UN-backed conference. One notable absence, the U.S. The U.S. still has not signed on to the Basel Convention, the nearly universal environmental treaty that the agreement is attached to. But just yesterday, an American submarine made the deepest man dive ever, and at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, he found a plastic bag.
Denver voted to decriminalize psychedelic mushrooms last week. The city is the first to remove the mushrooms from their controlled substance list, but still, the measure doesn't allow sales of the drug. It passed with a slim 50.56% margin, and opponents could call for a recount. Colorado was one of the first states to legalize recreational marijuana back in 2012.
Georgia passed one of the strictest abortion laws in the country last week. The law is a so-called heartbeat bill and outlaws abortion 6 weeks after conception, before some women know they're even pregnant. The law leaves room for the prosecution of doctors involved in an abortion and grants legal personhood to fetuses. That means fetuses will be counted in Georgia's population, receive child support, and be able to collect money from lawsuits. However, there's some debate within both pro-life and pro-choice camps about whether the law could actually be enforced in this way. Now, Georgia is not the only state to pass more restrictions on abortion. Just weeks ago, Ohio passed its own heartbeat law and is currently debating legislation that critics say could ban insurance coverage for some forms of birth control. And this week, the Alabama State Senate debated a bill that would outlaw abortion outright. So to discuss this, we'd like to welcome in our panel. We have Mia Mamone, Editor-in-Chief of North by Northwestern, Emily Cerf from Planned Parenthood Generation Action, and Virginia Langmaid, NNN's own legal analyst. So why are we seeing more of this type of legislation right now?
I think it's pretty clear that the atmosphere of our country, led by Donald Trump, has really given people who believe these laws should be in place kind of just power and support to bring them to legislation, bring them into their individual states, houses and stuff. I think it's definitely influenced by Trump.
I would definitely agree with that, but the more recent change has been on the makeup of the Supreme Court with the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh in place of Justice Kennedy. Kennedy was really the swing vote on the court, and he was the one who would kind of shift the decisions between more liberal and more conservative decision making. So with Kavanaugh replacing him, that leaves a lot of the decisions more up in the air, or because Kavanaugh is a more conservative justice, that means that Republicans think that they're probably going to be able to get him to vote on their ideological side. So bringing these cases up through the courts right now, the Republicans believe they have a better chance of overturning Roe v. Wade.
Now, Virginia, given existing Supreme Court decisions about abortion, what sort of legal challenges do you think this law might face?
So I would say at the outset, the Georgia law faces several legal challenges. The most obvious challenge is the challenge based on the precedent of Roe v. Wade, and the Georgia law tries to circumvent this by its fetal personhood segment. That by declaring a fetus to be a legal person in the state of Georgia, there's a legal idea that you could then circumvent Roe because Roe applies to fetuses, not to people, not to citizens of a certain state. However, that imbuing of legal personhood carries with it a whole other set of potential issues for the state. Like you said, the explicit law provides that that fetuses are now counted in the population, that you begin to collect child support at essentially the moment of conception. But that really opens Georgia up to other potential lawsuits. How do you keep an incarcerated woman who is pregnant? Because if her fetus is a legal citizen of the state, you're illegally incarcerating a citizen of the state of Georgia. A similar issue happens with deportations. When is a citizen a naturalized citizen? And then what happens if you have decided that you need to deport the mother, but she's pregnant with a child that could be born in the state of Georgia that you've declared to be a person? How do you suss out citizenship issues in that way? So it really opens Georgia up to more lawsuits, but I think that that's part of the intent of the vagueness of the law, is to allow this to be interpreted in mostly conservative-leaning courts.
Now, Virginia, you've read the whole bill, and you're from the state of Georgia. What stood out to you most?
I think what really stood out to me is the intentional vagueness of the law, right? So like I said, the law allows for fetal personhood, which is a new precedent in state law, and it doesn't describe any other parameters for that. So it outlaws abortion past 6 weeks, and it declares a fetus to be a person. Full stop. There's a lot of legal questions about what does it mean then when an abortion is given after 6 weeks? How are we counting that? Abortion itself is not a crime in Georgia state books, and a lot of legislators have said, oh, well, we will make it a crime. But that's purely in the hypothetical. In the reality, come January of 2020, aborting a fetus after 6 weeks becomes some sort of crime, but is it murder because this is a legal person? Is it the crime of abortion that isn't on the books? It's really unclear. And so this sort of vagueness leaves women's health in danger because they can't make appropriate decisions when to get an abortion, who to seek an abortion from. And that's the point.
All right, Mia, I'll go to you now. There's been a varied reaction to this and other heartbeat bills across the country. Actress Alyssa Milano even proposed a sex strike on social media, while some have proposed a boycott of films made in the state of Georgia. Are these appropriate strategies for opposing this kind of legislation?
I think in the case of Alyssa Milano, I definitely see where she's coming from. She feels very passionate about this. These are terrible laws that are going to really negatively affect American women. I think in her case specifically, there was a lot of backlash from progressive people, feminists who were saying that kind of perpetuated some more antiquated ideas about female sexuality and things like that. So I think that's something that she's grappling with, the left is more grappling with. But also I definitely think the economic side, the boycotts, that can certainly be powerful. We saw that in North Carolina, I believe, with the bathroom bills. Lots of major events pulled out of North Carolina, and that did change something. So I think that's certainly a possibility in this case.
Emily, any reactions? What separates this bill from others we've seen and this sort of onslaught of bills that we're seeing?
Well, I think a lot of these bills are really in the same vein in that they're all trying to bring these cases up through the court system, and they are all really trying to provoke a case that will reach the Supreme Court and overturn Roe v. Wade. So that's really the intention behind all of that. The heartbeat bill language in specific is very purposeful, and we see that in this Georgia law. They're doing that to invoke a sense of personhood that just frankly isn't true. It isn't accurate to what a fetus, if you can call it that, at 6 weeks is. Just to reiterate, a lot of women do not even know that they are pregnant at 6 weeks. That is a missed period to them. But they are using this language to sort of invoke this emotion in people who, carry these pro-life beliefs. So that is unique, I guess, to this Georgia and other heartbeat type legislation.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll keep an eye on this. We'll be back after the break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way. cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
Tensions between the U.S. and China are rising after a series of increased tariffs last week. To break it down, we turn to Justin with this week's Money Minute.
Thanks, Joey. Since President Trump took office, one of his main goals has been to help curb the U.S. trade deficit, and specifically that with China. Up until this point, there has been little success, with the deficit over $500 billion with China alone. To help address this, last week Trump raised tariffs from 10 to 25% on 40%, or $200 billion, of Chinese imports. China responded in a similar light, raising tariffs to 25% on $60 billion worth of American goods. The stock market was affected too, with the Dow dropping 600 points on Monday. And with that, I'd like to welcome our panel, Cameron Peters of College Democrats and Edmund Bannister of the NU Political Union. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
All right, now there's a lot of numbers and technical jargon here, but what it essentially boils down to is this. Trump thinks that the U.S. has been manipulated by China due to unfair trade agreements and shady practices overseas. So his solution was to smack tariffs on Chinese imports, and he says this results in China paying the U.S. billions of dollars. But in reality, the burden of a tariff is actually put on the American importers, effectively working as a tax. Do you think Trump actually knows what he's doing here with trade?
In terms of the tariff, no, absolutely not. There was an Axios story, I think, earlier today. Chuck Grassley, I believe, said that Trump views that understanding that tariffs are going straight into the U.S. pockets as an item of theology. So maybe there's something to his broader strategy, but in terms of the actual functioning of tariffs, it's pretty clear he has no idea how that works.
I mean, I have a slightly different take on it. You know, I definitely think that ultimately the costs of tariffs are going to be put on on U.S. consumers or the companies that are selling to those consumers. That being said, I do think that there are serious problems with the U.S.-China trade relationship that Trump has correctly identified. A problem with intellectual property theft, a problem with unfair trade practices, flooding the market with cheap goods. I think that these are problems that need to be addressed, and the Trump administration has made an assessment that it's better to try to have this fight now than in 10 years down the road when the China-U.S. trade relationship will be more advantageous towards them.
But are they fighting it in the right way? Because it seems that right when the U.S. raises its tariff, China just responds, so it just escalates into a way that discourages trade altogether. How should it be done?
I think ultimately it depends on whether there is a deal signed. It seems like they were really close to a deal this weekend, but now it seems like they're drifting away from it. Stocks crashed on Monday. They recovered a little bit today. So ultimately it really depends on whether the negotiators in the room can reach something fruitful before the economic damage from the tariff fight gets too out of control.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Trump is really just kind of trying to stare China down and hope they blink, hope that we inflict more damage on their economy than Chinese tariffs can inflict on ours. Last I checked, the trade talks are stalled, but I think Robert Lighthizer and Steve Mnuchin will be in Beijing soon. We don't know exactly when yet or exactly what they're going to be doing, but hopefully things will resume shortly and we'll be able to see some action on that, because I think Edmund's exactly right about his assessment.
So the president is also reportedly considering placing a tariff on all Chinese goods. What would that action do in escalating these tensions?
I think it would be pretty foolhardy. There are some goods we get from China, specifically rare earth metals, pharmaceuticals, that really American consumers need, and they need them at their current price points. So the idea of putting tariffs on those is particularly daunting. Putting tariffs on maybe like textile imports, something like that, might not have a huge impact on the average person. But I think definitely the Trump administration needs to be careful on where it's putting on its tariffs and how much they're actually putting on, because they don't want to be disproportionate in their response to what the Chinese are doing, and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the latest package proposed by the U.S. Trade Representative, pharmaceuticals and rare earth metals are currently exempted, but it's $300 billion, which is almost everything else. It is important that those remain exempted for the reasons Edmund said, but I think they do need to be careful, because if you kind of continue this game of brinkmanship, that's going to start having a lot more of an impact on U.S. consumers and farmers in particular, which is a really important voting bloc for Trump. So he could start harming his re-election chances potentially, depending on how this all pans out.
All right, thanks so much, gentlemen. We'll have to leave it there, but we'll be back with more Politicat after this.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
We know the news can be seriously overwhelming, so here are a few important stories you might have missed. The Department of Housing and Urban Development proposed a new rule that could force more than 100,000 low-income people out of subsidized housing. The proposed regulation is intended to prevent people who are undocumented from receiving federal housing aid. However, tens of thousands of families who will be evicted are of, quote, mixed status, meaning at least one member is undocumented while the others are citizens. Under this rule, the families would lose the entirety of their housing aid, and it's estimated that 55,000 children would be affected.
In the face of a serious economic crisis, the Cuban government announced that it is rationing food and other basic necessities. Commerce Minister Betsy Diaz-Velasquez told the state-run Cuban news agency the strengthening of the Trump administration's trade embargo was to blame. Economic experts say loss of aid from Venezuela has also been devastating. Cuba imports roughly 2/3 of its food. Chicken, eggs, rice, and soap are among the rationed goods.
44 states are suing Teva Pharmaceuticals USA, who they allege orchestrated a scheme with 19 other drug companies in a successful effort to raise drug prices, sometimes more than 1,000%. Politicians on both sides of the aisle, including President Trump and 2020 candidate Elizabeth Warren, have criticized rising prices in the drug industry. Teva Pharmaceuticals says it will fight the lawsuit.
A community in West Virginia says it was the victim of fraud, according to a story this week from the New York Times. When a nonprofit called Mind Minds came to town, they supposedly promised to teach people how to code and get them well-paying jobs. The organization preached innovation in a state with one of the poorest economies in the country. However, more than 24 former students from West Virginia are pursuing a lawsuit, alleging the program was a fraud. Only one of the person ultimately got a job, and he was fired after about a year.
So when we were having our pitch meeting this week, we noticed that there were an abundance of stories for that News You Didn't Know segment. They were all really, really interesting. There were like 11 or 12 that at least someone in our newsroom hadn't heard of before, and we're all journalistically inclined students. So we picked the 4 that we found most pressing at the time, but we decided we wanted to have a conversation about where to find less noisy news, look beyond the headlines, and find interesting international stories or stories that impact a community but could have a larger global or national impact. So we're wondering where you look for news that isn't just 2020 candidates all the time.
Well, I would give you 2 sources. The first would be The Economist. They have really great news articles that generally tend to focus on aspects of a big news story that may not be covered well, or something obscure that you wouldn't normally read about in, say, the New York Times. Another good place to go is to just, I don't know, try to find an internet forum that's reasonably interesting, that culls news stories well. There are certain pages on reddit.com that are very useful for me. I don't know.
Yeah. For my part, in terms of foreign policy, I really love Foreign Affairs. It's not exactly a to-the-minute news, but it does a lot of really interesting deep dives on big issues. And for more to-the-minute news, Twitter is honestly great. I spend too much time on there, but depending on who you follow, you can kind of get a look into some really interesting communities outside of the normal Twitter journalism hive mind. So there's some value to that.
What impact do you think the 2020 race and 2020 coverage has had on some of these headlines almost getting lost? Because it seems that whenever you turn on the news, it's just about 2020 when there's a whole another world that's still out there.
I think it's definitely drowning things out a little bit. I don't think it's going to get much better in the foreseeable future. We are up to 22 candidates as of today, and we've got the first debate coming up in June. So I think it's a problem. I'm not sure what the best solution is, because unfortunately, in such a dramatic race, that's just what's getting clicks right now. But there definitely is stuff getting drowned out, like the stories you just highlighted.
I think that generally cable news, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, are I don't want to say junk, but they're not the best places to get your news from. They don't do segments like this. They pretty much stick to 2020 race information, maybe one or two other stories on top of that. There's not a lot of diversity of coverage, and the coverage that you do get is very partisan. So I would steer away from that.
And before we wrap, we know it's registration week here on campus, which can be very stressful. You're a senior. You're out of here. You don't have to worry about it. Are
Never
you?
again.
I am not.
You're not,
I
yeah.
say that, but I went to Chicago Law School.
So what are some journalism or poli-sci classes that have really stood out to you that have maybe helped you dig deeper into the news or politics in that realm?
Well, let's
You go
see.
first.
Not exactly a accessible journalism class, but Medill on the Hill. If you're a Medill student, that's absolutely the single best way to dig deep into journalism and politics. It's absolutely just the full immersion, kind of throw you in the deep end, but it's amazing. Beyond that, I really enjoyed globalism with Stephen Nelson, or globalization. Sorry, that's a bad slip. Globalization with Stephen Nelson. That gives a really good perspective on how international politics work, and particularly on the trade side of things, like we were just talking about in our earlier segment, I think.
Well, Edmund, thanks. I'll give a quick shout out to Dilemmas of American Power. I'm very into foreign policy as well, international studies.
Yeah.
We do a lot of reading of very in-depth articles in that class, so I think it ties in very nicely. Love that class.
I mean, I would just say don't necessarily do it by the course title. Do it by the professor. Try to ask, what they're like, what their teaching style is like. Shout out to Robin Bates in the history department. His classes are always excellent. So try to take a class with him if you can.
Do you feel old and jaded?
I feel old and optimistic. That's what I feel.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. We'll see you after the break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
To end our show tonight on a fun note, we're playing a game, Head Lies. We'll read you 3 headlines, 2 of them real, 1 of them fake. You guys figure out which one is not true. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, first, a recently published research from the journal Current Biology has shown that penguin and elephant seal poop helps create biodiversity in Antarctica. Second, a rap video that includes a dancing bottle of fentanyl is being used as a major piece of evidence in a trial for racketeering charges against an opioid company. And lastly, last week, an Alaskan town passed city legislation declaring that due to sensitive hearing of local moose, they will be implementing mandatory quiet hours after 9 p.m. across the town, and the legislation will go into effect in early 2020.
You first.
See, I'm going to say the moose story is false.
I'm also going to go with
Yeah.
the Moose story.
The Moose story is so specific. That's kind of a hard one to make up. Are you sure you think it's false?
Yep.
We do
Yeah.
have a
I'm gonna
very
stick with it,
creative
yeah.
writing team.
I'm
All right,
stick
well, the
with
Moose
it.
story is
As a
false.
former
I thought if you go,
Alaskan, I'm
I thought the
pulling-
more specific you go, the more likely it's to be true, because that's kind of hard to make
I
up.
would move
I'm
to that
pulling-
town.
I'm pulling former Alaskan on this and saying, yeah.
Okay, you are correct. That one
Okay.
is incorrect.
All right, okay, second round. Very impressive. See if you can maintain your winner status. Okay. First, Elon Musk said this weekend that universal internet coverage will likely take only 6 more launches of 60 satellites. When someone pointed out that equaled 420 satellites, Musk responded, quote, "That might not be my lucky number." Second, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, announced yesterday plans for a post-climate change financial network involving banks in space. And third, Jeff Bezos announced this past week plans for a lunar lander to be built by 2024. The lander will not only take astronauts to the moon, but also be a step toward development of a moon colony.
I feel like I glanced at something about Bezos and space, so I'm
Yeah.
going to guess
So you can-
the second one.
I'm going for the first one. I think the Elon Musk headline is false.
What's your logic?
I don't know. I think, Elon Musk is a fan of...
We always throw an Elon Musk one in here just to mess with you.
Rattled right now. It seems
Yeah,
Elon Musk
you know what?
and
I'm gonna
Bezos
go with
come up
I'm gonna
every
go with
week.
the Jamie Dimon is less creative than Elon Musk, so I'm gonna stick with set number 2.
Stick with your gut. You are correct. No banks in space. That is all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much for playing along with us. We'll
Thank
see
you.
you next week on Politicat. I'm Joey Sapchik.
And I'm Justin Sweetwood. Good night.